I think, ladies and gentlemen, that we certainly live in very uncertain times. And let me also say that if I don't answer all the questions that you might have, and I suspect there'll be more questions than what I'm going to talk about, I'm very happy to come back at some time if you would like me to do so. But we do live in uncertain times. And of course, as we all know, so much of our attention is focused on immediate issues that attract the attention of politicians and policymakers, result in eye-grabbing headlines, and confuse, I think, probably an already uncertain public. I realize, and I certainly got this impression as a senior officer, how difficult it is to change a viewpoint that you've already uttered. And certainly when I headed our Defence Intelligence Organisation, the greatest challenge I had was to tell somebody that what I told them yesterday may not be right today. That, unfortunately, is what the world's about. Very often it is because we get new information we didn't have before, or we realize the information we had before was disinformation, which was deliberately put our way to confuse us. But telling particularly politicians that what they said yesterday as a result of the advice they got from us was incorrect was not a particularly heartwarming exercise. I think a further challenge is that today we have more information than ever. And the amount of information that's available, if anything, is increasing and going to continue to increase. Some of that information is contradictory, some of it's put out deliberately to be contradictory. But it's very difficult in some ways for young people in particular to come up with an issue that they believe in, because the next day they find someone else will tell them something different. That's the reality of life. I'm also conscious how difficult it is to change policies and research requirements. It takes time to do these things, time that often requires a change in attitude, education, social outlook, and so on. So all these issues are in fact difficult. I'd like to talk very briefly, if I could, on 5 particular issues. I'm going to be very brief because normally this takes more like 40 minutes to talk about. But I'm going to talk on 5 issues which I think are there and which we're certainly starting to consider more. But my sense is that if we don't pay more attention to them and start trying to ameliorate their outcomes, then certainly future generations, our children and their children, are going to have to put up with significant issues. Now, I suspect that COVID-19 is something along those lines. Who would have predicted COVID-19, say, a year before it happened? There are many issues like that. So I just want to talk very briefly about these 5 issues. They're very debatable. You may well disagree with them, and you may well have a lot of questions. But my sense is that we need to watch this. The first issue I'd like to talk about very briefly is demography, population. To my mind, the vast and rapid increase in population we've had has probably caused most of these problems, and yet it's hardly ever mentioned along those lines. If we were to map, for instance, the population growth that we've had over the last 200,000 years, we would see a chart that looks like that, and then suddenly takes off like that. The first billion people appeared on Earth in 1804, the next in 1923, the next about 25 years later, and of course we had the 7th billion in 2011. Recent statistical analysis by the United Nations suggests that by the middle of the century we'll have roughly about 9.2 billion, and by the end of the century somewhere in the order of 11.6, I think. What of course is happening is that the annual increase in population on a percentage basis has dropped dramatically. The year in which we had the most number of people compared with the previous year was in 1967, when there was an increase of 2.1%. The increase today is just under 1%. So in fact, the rate of increase has certainly slowed and will continue to slow. But there will still be considerably more people on Earth. Now, one of the challenges, of course, is that virtually all the population is in developing countries, all the population increase. And indeed, this is resulting in what we're increasingly calling demographic fatigue, where governments, for instance, lose the support and the confidence of their people simply because they can't handle the increase in population. They can't find the resources or the ways of providing health and education, or finding jobs, and of course looking after an increasingly larger percentage of an aging population. One of 2 outcomes tend to follow this. the government fails, or it becomes more authoritarian. And it's possible to state at this stage that there are at least 10 countries in Africa where this is the outcome. And this is something we're going to see even more in the future. Another issue, of course, that also is starting to get more attention, but not probably enough, is that we have an increasingly aging population worldwide. By 2050, for the first time ever, there will be more people in the older age group, over 60, than there are in the youngest age group, under 50. In 2050, that will be the first time that happens. It's anticipated that by about halfway through the century, 2050, we will have people over 80 that will be about a fifth of the world's population. That's amazing. And of course, do we have the ability to look after those people in a way that we think they should be looked after? I think the other issue that probably from a population point of view needs to be considered is that of gender imbalance. In other words, in various parts of the world, we have more men than we have women. This, of course, came to a head, I suppose, when China started the one-child policy. And although it's in fact changed that policy, as it did in 2015, by and large, Chinese families are not prepared to have more than one child. This is occurring, of course, around the world. And recently, the Indian Bureau of Statistics issued a statement that looked at both the situation from the point of view of China and India. And it made the analysis that in China, by 2050, for every 100 marriageable women, there could be as many as 180 men. That's significant. Now, I remember talking to a group of people along these lines about something like this, and I made a terrible mistake. I said, now you men in the room here, how would you feel about that? And there was a very elderly man sitting at the back who kept talking to people on either side of him when I was speaking. And in a loud voice he said, I know how I'd feel, a damn sight richer and far less stressed. That's not what I wanted to hear. Now let me say something about the next issue that I look at, and this is something, of course, which you will all be familiar with, and that's the issue about food and water. And certainly my organization started to look at this 12 years ago. Today, every university has some section somewhere that's looking at this issue. I think it's fair to say that 50 years ago, we had half the population we have today. They were not as wealthy, they didn't consume as many calories, they ate less meat, they required less water for their food. They inflicted less damage on the environment. They took from the water systems roughly a third of what we do today. Things have changed, and today we have nearly 1 billion people who are chronically malnourished or impoverished. It's said, for instance, that 6 million children die every year throughout the world as a result of food and water problems. 6 million. That's the same as saying 17,000 a day. Can you imagine the headlines tomorrow if there was some natural disaster somewhere where 17,000 people died? And yet it's hardly mentioned. This is a major issue. I think there are two issues that require people to think more about. One, of course, is the arable land. And I'll talk very briefly about that shortly, because there's no doubt that our arable land is becoming smaller and more difficult to maintain. And the other one is water. Nearly a third of the world's cropland, for instance, is losing soil faster than it can replace it. Erosion by wind and water is a worldwide challenge. We have a number of dust bowls. Those of you who've been to Beijing, for instance, in that period when the wind changes and blows from the northwest, will recognize in the sky, which is brown with dust. Open your motel room and in will come a cloud of dust. Well, that's certainly known, and the Chinese are attempting to do something about it. There is another major dust bowl in Africa which gets hardly any mention. Lake Chad, for instance. Lake Chad is a major sub-Saharan water system. It has about a third of the water it had 50 years ago, and twice the population relying on that water. This issue is happening in many parts of the world. I should also say that last year in fact the year before, was the year of soil, the first time they'd had that. And for the first time we started to get a sense of the global impact of our soil degradation. Now we've got it here in Western Australia, yet at the same time we'll also be told that there is more grains being produced in Western Australia than ever before. But the bottom line is that soils are depleting everywhere. And I think one of the challenges is that soil is a complex business. We've got a large number of scientists who look at various components of that. But linking them all together is something that has been very difficult. And I'm talking about the linkage between water, nutrients in the soil. Microbiology is an issue in soil. Without microbes in the soil, we would not be able to allow things to happen in the soil that need to occur. Soil carbon, soil structure. If the soil is as hard as it is in most of Australia, the water simply lands on the surface and either washes away or evaporates. And of course, this science is very important and is bringing together the fragmented issues which are so important. And we also know that many of our large lakes and inland seas have in fact shrunk considerably. Look at the Aral Sea, for instance. That's a very good example. Half the wetlands of Europe and North America no longer exist, and wetlands are very important. I think if there was a summary to all of this, is that for every 10 people, at least 3 do not have access to safe drinking water. And that situation, from all I can see, is only getting worse. Now let me say something very briefly about the next issue, which of course is climate change. I think climate change is getting a lot more attention. Mr. Trump, having left when he did, of course took away some of the opposition to that. But nevertheless, there's no doubt that climate change is an issue we need to take consideration about. It gets a lot of attention. There are a number of scientists who don't agree with the general concept. And certainly there are a number of business people who deliberately don't agree because it would have an impact, a negative impact on their business. But there's no doubt that climates are changing. We've of course had the hottest days. In the last decade, we've had probably 3 or 4 of the hottest years on record. There are statistics which suggest that there is more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there has been for the last 800,000 years. And of course, all these statistics don't help in some ways because they've then got to be translated into what they mean and how do we prepare ourselves to deal with them. And that I think is probably one of the really greatest challenges we face. Having said that, I have a sense that there's much more consideration starting to be given to this. Whether that's happening fast enough is yet to be seen. I think also science has got a fairly a clear understanding of the trend, but when they come to analyze the impacts of the trend, they also tend to have a fairly wide range of outcomes. The world's heating is likely in the next 20 to 30 years to increase anything from 0.6% to 6%. That's a big variation. And of course, as you know, the ice systems in the world are all rapidly declining. The Arctic, for instance, is now exposed land which hasn't been seen for literally thousands of years. That leads to sea level rises, acidic water, increasing acidic water, depletion of coral reefs and all those sorts of things. Now let me just say about the next one. This is a difficult one, I know. And in fact, some analysts think that this is the greatest challenge we meet. Someone out there is listening. And this is the sense that we have of rising global inequality. Now, of course, we've always had inequality, but let me give you some idea of the sort of statistics that are starting to emerge. 6% of the world's population is said to own 52% of its assets. The 1,125 billionaires, and I suspect there's a few more than that now, but they collectively owned 4 times that of the 50% of the poorest people. 43% of the world's population has incomes of less than $2.50 a day. That's incredible. Of course, we've always had inequality. Look back on history. You know, the castle on top of the hill. We've always had inequality. But why is it more definite and more concerning now? Well, I think that globally, large elements of the lower and middle classes are starting to mistrust their economic system when they see the rich getting richer, but they stay much the way they are. That's one issue. I think most developed countries have a marked worsening of domestic inequalities. It's not just a case of having the rich and poor countries, the developed and underdeveloped countries, but even within developed countries, there seems to be a rising sense of inequality. In the United States, there are more people involved in that type of business at the bottom end of the equality issue than there have been since the Great Depression. Similar things are happening in Europe. So it's not just the underdeveloped countries that are suffering from this issue. I think there's also a concern about the challenge to equal opportunity. After all, the rich people can afford to send their children to certain universities. They can have an impact upon the social and other wealth-related issues. And that is seen in some ways to be of concern. Of course, we live in the information age, where there is so much information out there. Much of it is contradictory, put out deliberately to hide certain issues or to give impetus to a particular approach. And that further confuses us. Someone also said to me quite recently that one of the concerns they had was that of families. And I don't know whether this is quite right or not, but certainly I have a sense that it could be. And that is that families, we as children, were influenced by what our parents told us. And they in turn were influenced by what their parents had told them, the schools that they went to, the church they went to, the community they lived within. Today, increasingly, that family approach that was there before is starting to erode. There are more single-parent families than ever before. Children go to school now and exchange information which is different to what their parents may have told them. And this, in turn, tends to breed uncertainty. And the more uncertainty there is, the less ability we have to come to terms with things. I'd also like to mention that we live in the information age. And of course, we're used to this now. We've seen how information has changed. We've seen how technology has changed work and other habits. And one of the challenges I think that we face is that we're struggling to keep up with technological change. And of course, this will have particular impacts on future employment. If we look at technology, automation, for instance, 3D printing, artificial intelligence, and what have you, increasingly we're seeing technology having an impact on work habits, on the ability for people to work. The McKinsey Research Institute provided a report recently that said by 2030, not too far away, something like 40 million jobs in East Asia alone will be replaced by robotics. 40 million. Now those 40 million people require that work to provide the income to feed their families, to send them to schools and what have you. Very interesting issue. Last point that I would make is that I also was talking to someone, an American recently, who had established a small factory in the outskirts of Detroit. This was a factory that manufactured, and I've forgotten what he called it, but it was a computer-type object. It cost him, his factory was totally automated. He used a Chinese model which employed people to develop the processes that he automated. And he produced this tablet for something like 69 cents. And of course, he could close his factory at any time and open it at any time. It could work 24 hours if necessary. And it was located very close to the customer. So the movement of the object to wherever it was going was easy. It was also located in an area where people expected that industrial output to use the laws and resources of that country. The Chinese factory that produced the same amount had over 500 people working on it. His had 5. That's something of the future that we'll have to think about. So ladies and gentlemen, I realize that time is very short. I do apologize for that. I'd be very happy to come back and talk on any of these issues. Thank you very much for your attention.